The luxury suite at the Four Seasons Miami, where Anjali Varma's decomposing body was discovered by housekeeping staff, contained evidence of a struggle so violent that blood spatter reached the marble ceiling, transforming what should have been a paradise penthouse into a crime scene that would expose the dark reality behind the fairy tale romance that had convinced a desperate Indian housemaid to abandon everything she knew in pursuit of an American dream that became her ultimate nightmare. Anjali Varma had spent 14 years scrubbing floors and washing dishes in the affluent Bandra district of Mumbai, watching wealthy families live lives of comfort and opportunity that seemed impossibly distant from her own existence in a cramped one-room apartment shared with Suresh, her unemployed husband whose drinking problems and violent temper had convinced her that escape was the only path to survival and dignity in a world that offered few alternatives for women trapped in poverty and abusive marriages. The online relationship that would ultimately cost Anjali her life had begun through a domestic worker networking website where Richard Coleman's profile had promised employment opportunities and potential romance for Indian women seeking better lives in America, presenting himself as a successful oil executive who valued traditional women and could provide security, respect, and financial stability that seemed like miraculous salvation to someone whose daily reality involved verbal abuse, economic desperation, and the constant fear that her husband's escalating violence would eventually result in serious injury or death. The months of digital courtship that preceded Anjali's departure from Mumbai had been carefully orchestrated by Richard to exploit her vulnerability and desperation, with promises of marriage, financial support for her family, and opportunities to build an independent life in Texas that would free her from the cultural constraints and economic limitations that had defined her existence since childhood in rural Kerala, where educational opportunities for girls were limited and economic prospects remained tied to marriage arrangements that prioritized family obligations over individual happiness. The decision to leave Suresh and travel to America had required Anjali to overcome not only her husband's violent opposition and threats, but also the disapproval of extended family members who viewed her choice as scandalous. Abandonment of traditional values and marital duties, creating isolation and emotional turmoil that made Richard's promises of understanding and acceptance seem like divine intervention rather than calculated manipulation designed to lure vulnerable women into dangerous situations. The tourist visa that enabled Anjali's travel to the United States had been secured through documentation provided by Richard, who had convinced immigration authorities that she was visiting for legitimate tourism purposes while concealing his true intentions and her plans to establish permanent residence through marriage to an American citizen who could provide the legal status and economic opportunities that would justify the enormous personal risks she was taking by leaving her homeland. The farewell that Anjali shared with her cousin Priya Menon at Mumbai's international airport had been filled with warnings about the dangers of trusting unknown men and the vulnerability of Indian women in foreign countries, but Anjali's desperation to escape her circumstances had overwhelmed her natural caution and family concerns, leading her to dismiss reasonable fears in favor of embracing what appeared to be her only chance for happiness and freedom. The first weeks of Anjali's relationship with Richard in Miami had seemed to validate her optimistic expectations, as he provided luxury accommodations, expensive gifts, and attentive behavior that contrasted dramatically with the neglect and abuse she had experienced in her marriage to Suresh, creating a honeymoon period that temporarily masked the controlling and possessive tendencies that would eventually escalate to deadly violence. The gradual revelation of Richard's true character had begun with subtle restrictions on Anjali's independence and social interactions, evolving into demands for complete obedience and submission that differed from her husband's crude domination only in its sophisticated presentation and the financial resources that enabled more elaborate forms of psychological manipulation and control. The isolation that Richard imposed on Anjali was facilitated by her legal vulnerability as someone without immigration status, family support, or knowledge of American systems that could provide protection from domestic violence, creating a power dynamic where his threats about deportation and abandonment carried devastating implications that prevented her from seeking help or attempting to escape when his behavior became increasingly dangerous and unpredictable. The cramped tenement apartment in Mumbai's Dharavi slum, where Anjali Varma had spent the first 34 years of her life, contained few possessions of value beyond the faded photograph of her deceased parents and the small collection of English-language books that represented her secret dreams of education and opportunity that had been systematically crushed by poverty, gender expectations, and a marriage arrangement that had transformed her from an optimistic young woman into someone whose daily existence revolved around survival rather than hope for meaningful change. The domestic work that Anjali performed for wealthy families in Bandra provided her with glimpses of lives filled with comfort, travel, and choices that seemed to exist in a different universe from her own reality of 14-hour workdays, verbal abuse from employers who viewed her as barely human, and return each evening to an apartment where Suresh's unemployment and alcoholism had created an atmosphere of constant tension and escalating violence that made her fear for her physical safety. The marriage to Suresh Varma had been arranged by relatives who viewed the union as appropriate matching of economic circumstances rather than consideration of compatibility or mutual affection, creating a relationship dynamic where Anjali's role was defined by domestic service and submission, while Suresh's masculinity was measured by his ability to control and dominate someone who had no realistic alternatives for independence or escape from their shared poverty. The pattern of abuse that characterized Anjali's marriage included not only physical violence during Suresh's drinking episodes, but also psychological manipulation that blamed her for their financial struggles, criticized her appearance and intelligence, and threatened more severe consequences if she attempted to seek employment that would take her away from their apartment for extended periods or provide her with income that might enable independence from his authority. The discovery of Richard Coleman's profile on the domestic worker website had occurred during one of Anjali's brief breaks at an internet cafe, where she occasionally searched for employment opportunities that might provide escape from her circumstances, finding instead what appeared to be a miraculous opportunity for both work and romance with an American businessman who claimed to value traditional Indian women and could provide visa sponsorship for the right candidate. The initial communications between Anjali and Richard had been conducted through careful translation assistance from educated customers at the internet cafe, as her limited English skills required help in crafting responses that would present her in the most favorable light, while also expressing genuine gratitude for his interest in her situation and his apparent willingness to provide opportunities that seemed too generous to be authentic, but too appealing to ignore. The courtship that developed through months of email exchanges and video calls had been designed by Richard to gradually build trust and emotional dependency while gathering information about Anjali's vulnerabilities, family situation, and motivations that would enable him to craft promises and guarantees specifically tailored to her deepest needs and most desperate desires for escape from her current circumstances. The promises that Richard made during their digital relationship included not only marriage and financial security, but also opportunities for Anjali to bring her younger sister to America for education, support for elderly relatives in Kerala, and respect for her cultural traditions and religious practices that suggested understanding and appreciation for her background rather than the cultural dismissal and racism that many Indian women experienced in relationships with Western men. The decision to accept Richard's invitation to visit America had required Anjali to overcome not only Suresh's violent opposition and threats of retaliation, but also her own fears about traveling alone to a foreign country where her legal status would depend entirely on someone whose true character remained largely unknown, despite months of communication that could have been carefully calculated deception rather than genuine romantic interest. The visa application process had been facilitated by documentation that Richard provided, including financial guarantees and invitation letters that presented Anjali's trip as tourism rather than immigration, creating legal vulnerabilities that would later make it impossible for her to seek help from authorities who might view her as someone attempting to overstay her permitted visit rather than a victim of domestic violence and human trafficking. The farewell gathering that Anjali's extended family organized before her departure had been filled with warnings from female relatives who understood the dangers faced by Indian women in foreign countries, but their concerns were tempered by recognition that her current circumstances offered little hope for improvement and that Richard's promises represented her best opportunity for building a life with dignity and financial security. The first-class flight from Mumbai to Miami that carried Anjali Varma toward what she believed would be her new life represented the most luxurious experience of her existence, with attentive service and comfortable accommodations that seemed to validate Richard Coleman's promises about the lifestyle he could provide, while also creating overwhelming anxiety about her ability to adapt to American culture and expectations that might be completely different from everything she had known in her 34 years of life in India. The arrival at Miami International Airport had been carefully orchestrated by Richard to create maximum psychological impact, with a limousine service and luxury hotel accommodations that demonstrated his wealth, while also establishing immediate dependence on his generosity and guidance for navigating American systems and customs that seemed impossibly complex to someone whose previous travel experience had been limited to local buses and trains within Maharashtra state. The Four Seasons penthouse suite where Richard had installed Anjali represented a level of luxury that exceeded even her most optimistic fantasies about American prosperity, with marble bathrooms, designer furnishings, and panoramic views of Biscayne Bay that created surreal contrast with the cramped tenement conditions she had left behind in Mumbai and reinforced her gratitude for what appeared to be miraculous transformation of her circumstances through Richard's intervention. The initial weeks of their relationship in Miami had been characterized by Richard's attentive behavior and generous provision of clothing, jewelry, and experiences that made Anjali feel valued and cherished in ways she had never experienced during her marriage to Suresh, creating emotional bonds and psychological dependency that would later make it difficult for her to recognize warning signs when his behavior began shifting toward control and manipulation. The cultural isolation that Anjali experienced in Miami was compounded by her limited English proficiency and lack of familiarity with American social customs, making her completely dependent on Richard for communication with service providers, navigation of basic tasks like banking and shopping, and interpretation of legal requirements that governed her stay in the United States under tourist visa conditions that prohibited employment or permanent residence. The first signs of Richard's controlling nature had emerged gradually through seemingly reasonable requests that Anjali limit her contact with family in India to avoid expensive international calling charges, restrictions on her independent movement outside the hotel for safety reasons, and suggestions that she focus on learning American customs rather than maintaining connections to Indian cultural practices that might interfere with her adaptation to her new environment. The psychological manipulation that Richard employed included alternating periods of extreme generosity and affection with subtle criticisms of Anjali's appearance, intelligence, and cultural background that gradually undermined her self-confidence, while creating anxiety about her ability to maintain his interest and support if she failed to meet his evolving expectations for behavior and submission to his authority. The legal vulnerability that defined Anjali's situation in America became increasingly apparent as Richard explained the complex immigration processes required for permanent residency, emphasizing her complete dependence on his cooperation and sponsorship, while also suggesting that any dissatisfaction with their relationship could result in immediate deportation and return to the poverty and abuse she had left behind in Mumbai. The isolation from potential support systems was systematically maintained through Richard's control of communication devices, monitoring of her activities when he was absent for business meetings, and discouragement of social interactions with hotel staff or other guests who might provide alternative perspectives on her situation or assistance in understanding her legal rights and available resources. The escalation of Richard's demands for sexual compliance and domestic submission began to mirror the power dynamics that had characterized her marriage to Suresh, but with the added complexity of cultural unfamiliarity and immigration status that made resistance seem both dangerous and potentially futile, given her lack of alternatives for survival in a foreign country where she had no legal protections or family support. The financial control that Richard maintained over every aspect of Anjali's daily life included monitoring of her expenses, restrictions on access to money or credit cards, and constant reminders about the costs associated with her presence in America that created obligation and debt consciousness that reinforced her dependence while also providing justification for increasingly demanding expectations about her availability and obedience. The communication with her family in India became increasingly difficult, as Richard imposed restrictions on international calls and monitored her conversations for signs of dissatisfaction or requests for assistance that might threaten his control over her situation, creating additional isolation and preventing her from accessing emotional support or practical advice that might help her recognize the dangerous patterns developing in their relationship. The transformation of Richard Coleman's behavior from attentive suitor to controlling captor accelerated during the second month of Anjali's stay in Miami, as his initial efforts to impress and seduce gradually gave way to systematic isolation and psychological manipulation designed to eliminate any possibility that she might seek independence or assistance from outside sources who could provide alternative perspectives on her increasingly dangerous situation. The business trips that Richard claimed required his absence from Miami for several days at a time, provided opportunities for him to test Anjali's compliance with restrictions on her movement and communication, using hotel security cameras and staff monitoring to ensure that she remained confined to their suite while he traveled, supposedly to oil industry meetings that were essential for maintaining the wealth that enabled their luxurious lifestyle. The punishment system that Richard implemented for perceived violations of his rules began with verbal abuse and financial restrictions that escalated to physical intimidation and threats about her immigration status that demonstrated his understanding of the psychological warfare required to maintain control over someone whose legal vulnerability and cultural isolation made resistance seem impossible and potentially life-threatening. The medical issues that Anjali began experiencing during this period included stress-related symptoms such as insomnia, loss of appetite, and anxiety attacks that reflected her psychological deterioration under constant pressure and fear, but Richard's control over her access to health care and his dismissive attitude toward her physical complaints prevented her from receiving professional assessment or treatment that might have provided outside intervention. The contact with Priya Menon in Mumbai became increasingly sporadic and monitored as Richard implemented restrictions on international communication that he justified through concerns about security and expenses, but which effectively prevented Anjali from maintaining connections to family members who might recognize signs of abuse or provide emotional support during her psychological crisis. The sexual violence that began during this period represented escalation from psychological manipulation to physical abuse that demonstrated Richard's complete disregard for Anjali's consent and dignity, with rape and sexual assault becoming regular features of their relationship that he justified through claims about his financial investment in her presence and his authority as an American citizen, sponsoring her continued residence. The threats about deportation became increasingly specific and detailed as Richard researched immigration enforcement procedures and shared information about detention facilities and legal processes that would follow discovery of her visa violations, creating constant terror about potential consequences of seeking help from authorities who might prioritize immigration enforcement over protection from domestic violence. The financial records that Richard maintained documented his expenses for Anjali's travel, accommodation, and living costs with meticulous detail that he used to reinforce claims about her debt to him and obligations to provide whatever services he demanded in exchange for continued support, creating psychological pressure that transformed gratitude into guilt and fear about the consequences of failing to meet his expectations. The surveillance techniques that Richard employed included monitoring of Anjali's phone calls and internet usage, tracking of her movements within the hotel through security cooperation, and psychological manipulation that convinced her that escape attempts would be detected and punished through immediate deportation or worse consequences that he suggested might include violence against her family members in India. The escalation toward lethal violence began with Richard's increasing frustration about Anjali's emotional withdrawal and depression, which he interpreted as ingratitude and disrespect rather than natural responses to abuse, leading to more frequent and severe physical attacks that demonstrated his willingness to inflict serious injury to maintain psychological control and sexual access. The preparation for murder that would later be evident in forensic analysis included Richard's research into body disposal methods, his establishment of false narratives about Anjali's supposed departure from Miami, and his careful timing of the final attack to coincide with a period when his business travel would provide alibis and opportunities to establish distance from the crime scene. The final argument that precipitated Anjali's murder began with her desperate attempt to contact Priya Menon and request assistance for returning to India, representing the first serious challenge to Richard's authority that triggered the explosive rage and calculating violence that would end her life, while also demonstrating his complete transformation from manipulative predator into someone capable of premeditated murder to protect his criminal activities. The brutal murder of Anjali Varma occurred on a sweltering Tuesday evening in September, when Richard Coleman's carefully constructed facade of sophisticated control finally collapsed into savage violence that would leave the luxury penthouse suite looking like a battlefield where someone had fought desperately for survival against an attacker whose rage and determination to kill had overcome any remaining constraints of conscience or concern about legal consequences. The attack that ended Anjali's life began when Richard discovered her attempting to use the Hotel Business Center computer to send an email to Priya Menon, requesting assistance for emergency return to India, representing the first direct challenge to his authority that triggered explosive fury and deliberate decision to eliminate someone who had become a liability rather than a controllable asset in his system of exploitation and abuse. The forensic evidence that would later be collected from the crime scene included defensive wounds on Anjali's hands and arms that demonstrated her attempts to protect herself during the prolonged assault, DNA material under her fingernails from clawing at her attacker, and blood spatter patterns that revealed the systematic nature of violence that had continued even after she was unable to resist or defend herself. The duration of the attack, estimated by medical examiners to have lasted between 20 and 30 minutes, reflected Richard's methodical approach to killing that included multiple forms of trauma designed to cause maximum suffering, while also expressing his rage about what he perceived as betrayal and ingratitude from someone who owed her life and opportunities to his generosity and support. The weapons that Richard employed in the murder included both his hands for strangulation and blunt objects from the hotel suite that were used to inflict head trauma, suggesting that the attack had begun as an attempt to subdue and punish Anjali, but had escalated to intentional killing when his initial violence failed to restore the psychological control that he required for their relationship to continue. The staging of the crime scene that Richard attempted after killing Anjali included efforts to suggest that her death had resulted from an accident or suicide rather than homicide, but his lack of experience with forensic science and crime scene manipulation left abundant evidence that would later enable investigators to reconstruct the actual sequence of events and identify him as the perpetrator. The disposal planning that Richard had researched in advance of the murder included information about body transportation and concealment methods that suggested premeditation rather than spontaneous violence, though his ultimate decision to leave Anjali's body in the hotel suite indicated either panic about implementing his disposal plan or confidence that his wealth and connections would enable him to avoid accountability through legal manipulation. The immediate aftermath of the murder included Richard's attempts to establish an alibi through documented presence at business meetings and social events that would have been impossible if he had been committing murder during the time frame when Anjali's death occurred. But his nervous behavior and inconsistent statements attracted attention from business associates who would later provide testimony about his suspicious conduct. The discovery of Anjali's body by hotel housekeeping staff occurred 36 hours after her death, when the decomposition process and distinctive odors had made concealment impossible, despite Richard's efforts to delay discovery through manipulation of cleaning schedules and access to the penthouse suite where he had installed her as his controlled companion. The initial police response to the crime scene was complicated by Richard's attempts to influence the investigation through his business connections and legal resources, but the obvious signs of violence and the absence of any evidence supporting accident or suicide theories quickly focused attention on homicide investigation rather than the alternative explanations that he had attempted to promote. The hotel security footage that would prove crucial for the investigation included recordings of Richard's movements during the period when the murder occurred, contradicting his claims about being elsewhere for business purposes, while also documenting his access to the penthouse suite during the time frame when Anjali was killed. The international dimensions of the case created additional investigative challenges as Miami police coordinated with authorities in India to verify Anjali's background and family connections, while also gathering information about her relationship with Richard that could provide insights into motives and patterns of abuse that had escalated to murder. Detective Laura Hayes of the Miami Police Department had investigated numerous domestic violence homicides during her 18-year career, but the murder of Anjali Varma presented unique challenges involving international jurisdiction, immigration status complications, and the sophisticated attempts at evidence manipulation employed by a wealthy perpetrator who understood how economic resources could be used to obstruct justice and avoid accountability for criminal violence against vulnerable foreign nationals. The initial examination of the crime scene revealed immediately that Richard Coleman's claims about Anjali's accidental death were contradicted by forensic evidence, including the defensive wounds that demonstrated her attempts to fight off an attacker, the multiple forms of trauma that indicated prolonged assault, and the blood spatter patterns that suggested systematic violence rather than accident or self-inflicted injury. The investigation into Richard's background uncovered a disturbing pattern of relationships with vulnerable women that had ended in mysterious circumstances, including 2 previous marriages that had concluded with contentious divorces involving allegations of domestic violence that had been settled through financial arrangements rather than criminal prosecution, suggesting systematic predatory behavior that had escalated to murder with Anjali. The financial records that investigators obtained through court orders revealed Richard's detailed documentation of expenses related to Anjali's presence in Miami, including payments for travel, accommodation, and living costs that he had apparently viewed as investments that entitled him to complete control over her body and activities, demonstrating the commercial perspective that had guided his exploitation. The communication evidence recovered from electronic devices included Richard's research into body disposal methods, his investigation of legal procedures for reporting missing persons, and his correspondence with business associates about establishing alibis that demonstrated premeditation and careful planning rather than spontaneous violence triggered by unexpected circumstances. The witness testimony provided by hotel staff revealed Richard's increasingly agitated behavior during the weeks before Anjali's murder, including complaints about her depression and withdrawal, demands for enhanced privacy and security measures, and suspicious requests about cleaning schedules and access to their penthouse suite that suggested preparation for criminal activity. The international cooperation required for the investigation included coordination with Indian authorities who provided background information about Anjali's family and circumstances, verification of her marriage to Suresh Varma, and assistance with notification procedures that respected cultural protocols while ensuring that her relatives received accurate information about the circumstances of her death. The immigration status issues that complicated the investigation included questions about Anjali's legal right to remain in the United States, her dependence on Richard for visa sponsorship, and the power dynamics created by her vulnerability to deportation that had enabled his systematic abuse and control while preventing her from seeking help from authorities who might have provided protection. The psychological profile that investigators developed for Richard Coleman revealed classic patterns of narcissistic personality disorder combined with sociopathic tendencies that explained his ability to maintain successful business relationships while engaging in systematic exploitation and abuse of women who lacked the resources or knowledge necessary to protect themselves from his manipulation. The forensic analysis of physical evidence included DNA testing that conclusively linked Richard to the assault, fingerprint evidence that contradicted his claims about the timeline of events, and blood evidence that demonstrated the systematic nature of violence that had continued even after Anjali was unable to defend herself or resist his attacks. The media attention that the case attracted brought focus to issues of domestic violence against immigrant women, the vulnerability of foreign nationals, to exploitation by American citizens who understood how to manipulate immigration law and cultural isolation for criminal purposes, and the need for enhanced protection services for victims who lacked traditional support systems. The legal proceedings against Richard Coleman were complicated by his wealth and connections, which enabled him to hire experienced criminal defense attorneys who attempted to exploit cultural stereotypes about Indian women and arranged marriages, while also challenging the admissibility of evidence and questioning the competence of international law enforcement cooperation that had been essential for building the prosecution's case. The arrest of Richard Coleman at his River Oaks mansion in Houston occurred 3 weeks after Anjali Varma's murder, When accumulated evidence from the Miami investigation had established probable cause for homicide charges, while also revealing the sophisticated planning and cover-up attempts that demonstrated his consciousness of guilt, deliberate efforts to avoid accountability for systematically exploiting and ultimately killing a vulnerable immigrant woman. The prosecution's case was methodically constructed around forensic evidence that conclusively linked Richard to Anjali's murder, witness testimony that established his pattern of controlling and abusive behavior, and financial records that demonstrated his commercial approach to their relationship that had treated her as purchased property rather than a human being deserving respect and protection under American law. The defense strategy attempted to portray Anjali as someone who had misrepresented her intentions and circumstances in order to exploit Richard's generosity, suggesting that cultural differences and communication problems had created misunderstandings about their relationship that had escalated to tragic consequences when she attempted to extort additional money or threaten exposure of their arrangement. The testimony provided by Suresh Varma, who traveled from Mumbai to testify about his marriage to Anjali and her desperation to escape their circumstances, provided crucial context about her vulnerability and genuine motivation for seeking opportunities in America, while also refuting defense claims that she had been engaged in deliberate deception or criminal conspiracy. The expert witnesses who testified about domestic violence patterns and the specific vulnerabilities faced by immigrant women provided essential education for jurors about power dynamics, psychological manipulation, and escalation patterns that explained how Richard's initial promises of love and security had evolved into systematic abuse and ultimately premeditated murder when his control was challenged. The victim impact statements presented by Anjali's family in Kerala, delivered through video testimony that required translation services, provided powerful evidence of her character and the devastating impact of her loss on relatives who had hoped that her journey to America would provide opportunities for education and advancement rather than exploitation and death that destroyed their trust in international marriage arrangements. The forensic evidence that proved most compelling to jurors included the defensive wounds that demonstrated Anjali's desperate attempts to protect herself, the DNA evidence that conclusively linked Richard to the assault, and the staged crime scene elements that revealed his attempts to conceal murder through manipulation of physical evidence and false narratives about the circumstances of her death. The financial evidence that documented Richard's systematic exploitation included detailed records of his expenses for travel, accommodation, and living costs that he had used to justify his authority and control over Anjali's activities, demonstrating the commercial perspective that had guided his treatment of her as purchased property rather than a romantic partner or potential spouse. The communication evidence that revealed Richard's planning and preparation for murder included his research into body disposal methods, his investigation of legal procedures for dealing with missing persons, and his correspondence with business associates about establishing alibis that demonstrated premeditation and calculated preparation rather than spontaneous violence. The international law enforcement cooperation that had been essential for investigating the case established important precedents for protecting foreign nationals from domestic violence, while also demonstrating the effectiveness of coordinated investigation techniques that could overcome jurisdictional boundaries and cultural barriers to pursue justice for victims who lacked traditional support systems. The jury deliberation lasted 6 days, as members struggled with complex questions about cultural dynamics, immigration vulnerability, and the degree of premeditation involved in Richard's crimes, ultimately reaching unanimous verdicts on all charges, including first-degree murder, sexual assault, and human trafficking, that reflected their recognition of the systematic nature of his exploitation and the deliberate character of his final violence. The sentencing phase focused on appropriate punishment that would reflect both the heinous nature of Richard's crimes and their broader impact on immigrant communities who needed assurance that American legal systems would protect vulnerable foreign nationals from domestic violence, while holding American citizens accountable for exploiting power imbalances created by immigration status and cultural unfamiliarity. The life sentence without possibility of parole that Richard Coleman received for the murder of Anjali Varma sent a clear message about American justice system commitment to protecting immigrant women from domestic violence, while also establishing legal precedents for prosecuting cases involving cultural manipulation. economic exploitation, and human trafficking that had been disguised as romantic relationships designed to lure vulnerable foreign nationals into dangerous situations. The victim advocacy movement that emerged from Anjali's case included enhanced support services for immigrant women experiencing domestic violence, improved training for law enforcement officers investigating crimes involving foreign nationals, and community education programs designed to help vulnerable populations recognize warning signs of exploitation while connecting potential victims with culturally sensitive resources and legal assistance that respected their unique circumstances. The legislative initiatives inspired by her murder included enhanced penalties for domestic violence crimes involving immigration status manipulation, mandatory cultural sensitivity training for law enforcement and court personnel, and improved coordination between immigration authorities and domestic violence agencies to ensure that victims could report abuse without fear of deportation or other consequences that might prevent them from seeking help when their safety was threatened. The international cooperation that had been developed for investigating Richard's crimes continued through ongoing efforts to monitor and disrupt criminal networks that specialized in exploiting immigrant women, while also sharing intelligence about predatory behavior patterns and operational methods used by American citizens who targeted vulnerable foreign nationals for commercial sexual exploitation disguised as romantic relationships. The policy changes that resulted from advocacy efforts included enhanced verification procedures for visa sponsorship claims, improved background checking for Americans seeking to bring foreign spouses to the United States, and strengthened protections for domestic violence victims who needed immigration relief without being subjected to additional scrutiny or deportation proceedings that could endanger their safety. The support services that were expanded in response to Anjali's case included culturally appropriate counseling programs, legal assistance for immigration issues related to domestic violence, emergency housing assistance for women fleeing abusive relationships, and job training programs that help survivors develop economic independence necessary for building safe and stable lives away from their exploiters. The educational initiatives that reached thousands of potential victims included multilingual materials about domestic violence recognition and prevention, community workshops that provided practical information about legal rights and available resources, and peer support programs that connected recent immigrants with established community members who could provide guidance and assistance during cultural adaptation challenges. The law enforcement improvements that resulted from enhanced training and policy changes included better investigation techniques for cases involving cultural barriers, improved coordination with victim advocates and interpreters, and more effective prosecution strategies that addressed defense attempts to exploit cultural stereotypes and immigration concerns to minimize criminal accountability for domestic violence and human trafficking. The research contributions that emerged from academic study of Anjali's case advanced understanding of predatory recruitment techniques used to exploit vulnerable immigrant women while also contributing to improved prevention strategies, enhanced victim identification protocols, and more effective intervention approaches that balanced cultural sensitivity with safety priorities and legal protection requirements. The memorial fund that was established in Anjali's honor provided financial assistance for immigrant women seeking to escape domestic violence, while also supporting educational programs that taught recent arrivals about their legal rights, available resources, and warning signs of exploitative relationships that might escalate to life-threatening violence, requiring immediate intervention from specialized support services. The ongoing monitoring of criminal networks revealed that Richard's case was part of larger patterns of exploitation involving American men who specifically targeted vulnerable foreign women through online platforms and visa sponsorship arrangements, leading to enhanced investigation and prevention efforts that addressed systematic predatory behavior rather than treating individual cases as isolated incidents. The community healing process within Miami's Indian American population involved difficult conversations about protection strategies for vulnerable community members, while also addressing cultural barriers that prevented victims from seeking help when traditional family support systems were unavailable, and immigration status created additional complications for accessing legal protection and social services. 5 years after Anjali Varma's brutal murder exposed the sophisticated methods used by American predators to exploit vulnerable immigrant women through false promises of love and opportunity, her case continued to influence domestic violence prevention efforts and immigration policy discussions about protecting foreign nationals from systematic abuse by citizens who understood how to manipulate legal systems and cultural vulnerabilities for criminal purposes. The Richard Coleman case had become a landmark prosecution that established important legal precedents for addressing human trafficking disguised as romantic relationships, while also demonstrating the effectiveness of international law enforcement cooperation in investigating crimes that crossed jurisdictional boundaries and required coordination between agencies with different legal systems and investigative capabilities. The victim protection services that had been enhanced in response to advocacy efforts showed measurable improvements in helping immigrant women escape dangerous situations, with increased reporting rates and successful prosecutions that reflected better training for law enforcement officers and more effective coordination between agencies responsible for immigration enforcement and domestic violence prevention. The educational impact of Anjali's story extended beyond formal prevention programs to include widespread public awareness about the sophisticated manipulation techniques used by predators who targeted vulnerable foreign women, helping potential victims recognize warning signs while also encouraging community members to provide support and assistance when they suspected exploitation or abuse. The policy advocacy that continued to focus on immigrant protection included ongoing efforts to strengthen legal remedies for domestic violence victims, improve coordination between agencies responsible for immigration and law enforcement, and maintain funding for specialized services that address the complex needs of foreign-born women experiencing abuse in cross-cultural relationships characterized by power imbalances. The international cooperation that had been essential for investigating Richard's crimes evolved into permanent frameworks for combating systematic exploitation of immigrant women, with specialized units in multiple countries sharing intelligence about predatory networks, while also developing prevention strategies that addressed recruitment techniques and victim vulnerability factors. The legislative achievements that resulted from advocacy work included enhanced penalties for domestic violence involving immigration status manipulation, improved victim compensation programs, and strengthened international cooperation requirements that facilitated investigation and prosecution of American citizens who exploited foreign nationals, while also ensuring that victims received protection rather than deportation. The research initiatives that were funded through foundation grants and government programs contributed to enhanced understanding of cultural factors that influenced immigrant women's responses to domestic violence, while also advancing knowledge about effective intervention strategies and prevention programs that could protect vulnerable populations without undermining legitimate international marriage arrangements. The community partnerships that developed between law enforcement agencies and immigrant advocacy organizations created sustainable frameworks for addressing domestic violence in foreign-born populations, with culturally sensitive approaches that respected traditional values, while also ensuring that victims received protection and assistance when their safety was threatened by systematic abuse and exploitation. The technological innovations that emerged from prevention efforts included better systems for monitoring online platforms used to recruit vulnerable women, enhanced verification procedures for visa sponsorship claims, and improved coordination between databases that tracked predatory behavior patterns and international travel by individuals with histories of domestic violence or human trafficking involvement. The ongoing impact of advocacy efforts extended beyond individual protection to include systematic improvements in immigration policy, law enforcement training, and victim support services that continued to evolve in response to new exploitation techniques while maintaining focus on the human cost of crimes that targeted vulnerable foreign nationals seeking legitimate opportunities for education, employment, and family building in America. The memorial services that were held annually on the anniversary of Anjali's death served multiple purposes, including honoring her memory, raising awareness about domestic violence in immigrant communities, and maintaining political pressure for continued improvements in prevention and support services that could protect other vulnerable women from experiencing similar exploitation and violence by predators who viewed foreign spouses as disposable property. 10 years after Anjali, Varma's American dream became a deadly nightmare in a Miami penthouse where her blood spattered the marble ceiling and her body bore witness to the savage violence that ended her desperate quest for dignity and opportunity. Her legacy lives on through the comprehensive changes in law enforcement, victim protection, and immigration policy that emerged from determination to ensure that her suffering would prevent similar tragedies for other vulnerable women seeking better lives in America. The Anjali Varma Center for Immigrant Women's Safety, established with federal funding and community support, has provided direct services to over 2,000 women, while also training hundreds of law enforcement officers, social workers, and victim advocates in culturally sensitive approaches that recognize the unique vulnerabilities faced by foreign-born individuals experiencing domestic violence and systematic exploitation by American citizens who understand how to manipulate immigration law for criminal purposes. The legislative changes that were influenced by her case continue to protect immigrant victims through enhanced legal remedies, improved coordination between federal and local agencies, and specialized court procedures that address cultural barriers while ensuring that foreign nationals receive equal protection under American law, regardless of their immigration status, English proficiency, or familiarity with legal systems that can provide safety and justice. The international cooperation agreements that were negotiated as a result of advocacy efforts continue to facilitate beneficial collaboration between law enforcement agencies in multiple countries, enabling effective investigation and prosecution of American citizens who travel abroad to recruit vulnerable women through false promises, while also supporting diplomatic relationships that balance national sovereignty with international justice and victim protection priorities. Richard Coleman remains incarcerated at a federal penitentiary in Texas, where his appeals have been consistently denied and prison records indicate no genuine remorse for his crimes, with continued attempts to blame Anjali for supposedly misrepresenting her circumstances and provoking the violence that ended her life while destroying the families and communities that had supported her dreams of building a better future in America. The ripple effects of Anjali's murder continue to influence discussions about protecting vulnerable immigrant populations from systematic exploitation, creating ongoing debates about balancing legitimate immigration enforcement with victim protection that require nuanced understanding of power dynamics and cultural factors that make foreign nationals particularly susceptible to domestic violence and human trafficking disguised as romantic relationships. Suresh Varma, who had initially opposed Anjali's departure from Mumbai but later became an advocate for justice in her case, established a small foundation that provides support for families of Indian women who have been victimized abroad, ensuring that Anjali's legacy includes practical assistance for relatives who struggle with grief, legal proceedings, and the complex emotions associated with losing loved ones to violence in foreign countries. Priya Menon, who continues to live with guilt about not recognizing the warning signs in Richard's communications with Anjali, became a prominent voice for educating Indian women about the dangers of online relationships with foreign men, creating awareness programs that help potential victims recognize manipulation tactics and understand their rights and resources when considering international marriage or employment opportunities. The community healing process within Kerala's migrant worker families involved difficult conversations about the risks faced by women seeking opportunities abroad, balancing recognition of legitimate possibilities for advancement with awareness of sophisticated predators who specifically targeted vulnerable individuals from economically disadvantaged backgrounds who had limited knowledge of legal protections available in destination countries. The policy changes that emerged from international cooperation included enhanced background checking procedures for Americans seeking to sponsor foreign spouses, improved verification of online relationship documentation, and strengthened coordination between immigration authorities and law enforcement agencies responsible for investigating human trafficking and domestic violence that exploited visa sponsorship arrangements for criminal purposes. The educational initiatives that continue to honor Anjali's memory include comprehensive programs for women considering international marriage or employment, providing practical information about legal rights, warning signs of exploitation, and resources for assistance when legitimate opportunities become dangerous, situations requiring immediate intervention from law enforcement or victim advocacy organizations. The story of Anjali Varma serves as a permanent reminder that while international marriage and immigration can create wonderful opportunities for love, family building, and economic advancement, these same possibilities can also be exploited by sophisticated predators who view vulnerable foreign women as disposable commodities rather than human beings deserving respect, protection, and the chance to pursue their dreams safely in countries that promise freedom and opportunity. Her memory lives on through every immigrant woman who finds safety through the protection services established in her honor, every law enforcement officer who receives training about cultural sensitivity in domestic violence cases, and every potential victim who learns to recognize and avoid the manipulation tactics that transform dreams of better lives into deadly nightmares that destroy families and communities across international boundaries.